Altman is back as OpenAI CEO, but the mood has shifted. Investors are keeping an eye on the broader landscape as governments lag behind the evolving tech, from Biden's new executive order to the EU's AI Act. So what's next in the road to regulation? Let's bring in former FDIC Chief Innovation Officer and Duke Professor Sultan Meghji and Axios technology reporter Ashley Gold to discuss more. Thank you for joining us this morning. Sultan, I want to kick things off with you. What does this open up for regulators? We essentially had what could have been an acquisition without an acquisition if Altman had stayed at Microsoft. What do you think regulators will be focusing on with this wake-up call?
Oh, this is an incredible issue, right? Because one of the things we're struggling with on the regulatory side is understanding the impact of AI and how to keep the centralization issues that happened with social media, that happened with 5G, that happened with cloud, and now with broader big tech issues. This just looks like another way to get past the regulatory landscape. There are a lot of conversations here in DC about, well, we didn't have that issue this time, but what if this had happened? And so it absolutely will be on the minds of regulators.
Ashley, what are you hearing from your sources about how lawmakers, policymakers who have been trying to come up with some kind of framework for these guardrails, how they've been watching these developments?
Absolutely. So in Washington, it's Thanksgiving week and lawmakers tend to be a little more quiet during that week. I was hoping to talk to more of them over the weekend. But what we heard specifically from Senator Mark Warner and a couple others is that this turmoil at the top of OpenAI just goes to show that there needs to be rules of the road from the government in place to make sure AI is safe for people and is working for the best of humanity, no matter who is at the helm of these big companies. The lawmakers like Sam Altman, he's made a good impression on them in his trips to Washington. But, this shakeup is quite telling that maybe at the top here, there's disagreement over how far this technology should go. And I think when Congress ramps back up after Thanksgiving, we're going to be hearing a lot more about that.
And Ashley, on that point about what this policy could look like, there's a few templates on the table, right? There's the bill from Josh Hawley, Richard Blumenthal. There's also the executive order that's on the table too. Where's the consensus right now? Is it about transparency? Is it about sharing, sort of the red teaming? Like where are you hearing about where this is likely to go and likely to pass?
So I would say that there is still not a ton of agreement on the broad contours of AI regulation, but where we are seeing some agreement come up is transparency. Like you said, people want explainability. They want to know how these algorithms work. They want to know when what they're seeing is generated by AI versus a human. So that transparency part is something that everybody agrees on. There's also agreement that only the sort of biggest, most complicated, most dangerous advanced models are the ones that should be highly regulated. There is a sense that smaller AI companies that are doing AI models that aren't quite as impactful should not be caught up in the same regulations as these foundation models that OpenAI and others are working on. So I think that's a bit of a lesson we learned from the social media era, that it is not one size fits all when it comes to regulating technology, and companies of different sizes have different needs. So there's a lot of discussion about sort of the right sizing these regulations.
So Sultan, to that point then, should it be about a large framework that sort of oversees everything, or sort of building on the existing laws to protect when it comes to the sort of data that's being mined, consumer protection? Is that a way to sort of stay on top of it as the technology itself races ahead?
Now, given the likelihood of Congress passing anything reasonable as somewhere between 0 and a negative number, we're going to have to make use of the existing laws and the existing interpretations. The challenge is they're exclusively based on risk, right? And they're not based on the capabilities or the impacts. And so it's sort of like saying, I have a regulation that works on a fax machine, therefore I'm going to apply it to email. It probably is good for the next year, maybe 2 years, but at some point Congress will have to start doing something to actually pass laws. The other challenge here is that foundational model is kind of a misnomer. There are dozens of companies that are very small, that are not publicly traded, that don't sit in front of the White House, that are fundamentally reshaping, for example, biotechnology or the markets. And so this notion of a framework based on size or scale of AI model is not going to work in this case, because the most impactful artificial intelligence companies aren't the ones in the news this week or last week or even for years. And so the way that it's being thought about, even inside of the regulatory frameworks, is going to miss a lot. And we're going to see issues over the next few years without a more comprehensive set of laws passed by Congress.
Sultan, when you think about these big tech names, you mentioned Microsoft, obviously been in the headlines, but Google, I mean, they have been under scrutiny from regulators for other issues, antitrust specifically. Microsoft, yes, they were under scrutiny for the Activision acquisition, but they've largely escaped some of that, partly because they've been in close conversation with these regulators. Yeah. I wonder if you think what has transpired over the last 5 days, that puts them right back in the center, the crosshairs of regulators, because in many ways it points to the sheer scale, the power, the money that Microsoft has in betting on this very technology. Absolutely.
I mean, what Microsoft has put just $10 billion into OpenAI and has the ability to fundamentally change what the board decided in 5 days with a couple of phone calls. And I think it does reframe how a lot of people are going to think about this. And whether it's Microsoft in particular or the big tech companies writ large, we're going to be in a situation, I'm positive, where the output of the last 5 days of chaos at OpenAI will fundamentally shift the regulatory lens back to the big tech companies that are writing these checks. And now coming out of this process of 5 days, previous to this, Microsoft did not have a board seat. They were not even board observers at OpenAI. It's very clear that they will. And so now there's a new regulatory concern. And I think an antitrust discussion is going to end up happening no matter what.
So Ashley, if we're going to end up having this antitrust conversation, then what does that mean for some of these innovators? As you've mentioned and Sultan mentioned, it's a lot of these smaller innovators flying under the radar who perhaps aren't catching the eye of regulators. So how do you think regulations will proceed from here? What are some of the most promising legislations that you're seeing?
So in the past couple of years, we've had Congress making a valiant attempt to update the antitrust laws for the digital age with the American Innovation and Competition Online Act, a couple of App Store bills. Those bills made it pretty far in Congress, but they did not make it over the finish line. Where we've seen most of the action has been in the courts and in the federal agencies. You've got ongoing tech antitrust cases at the Justice Department and at the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission has promised to look at OpenAI as well. So I think, like the other panelists were saying about Congress moving very slowly, that where we're going to see the most action is in these federal agencies and in courts. We have to see who ends up filing a lawsuit, and that is where we're going to see most of the action when it comes to antitrust in the coming years. I think that we're shifting toward a world where the antitrust laws will be updated for the digital age, but it is very slow going.
Sultan, we haven't necessarily talked about sort of the VC side of things. I mean, part of the what happened at OpenAI was, on the one hand, you had a nonprofit structure, but you had a for-profit arm where plenty of VCs were pouring in money there. Do you think that continues? You think they move forward a little more cautiously? I mean, give me the pulse on that, because you've got a good vision on that side too.
I think for the last, let's say, 12 months, especially since the release of ChatGPT, there's been this gold rush, or view of a gold rush in the venture community, investing in kind of anything and everything. I mean, a few years before that, we saw the same group of people investing in organizations like FTX, kind of, enthusiastically, but not too thoughtfully. I would hope that a lot of the venture capital firms out there that are investing are really getting back to basics and saying, is the thing I'm investing in structured the right way? Does it have the right governance model? Does it have a board of directors that's a credible governance mechanism? Do they have product? Do they have algorithm? Do they understand the regulatory landscape? Do they understand these various discussions that we're having here? And I think we're going to see an evolution away from, these massive checks for PowerPoint presentations, frankly, turning to something that's a little more meaningful. We're also in an interesting cycle, as we've seen over the last few years, where there are a lot of venture firms that are going off to raise right now, and their investments may or may not have shown promise or shown any sort of delivery. Most venture firms, even if they say they're 6 or 7 year funds, really are trying to get exits within 3 years. So if you're investing in something that's a PowerPoint presentation, you've got to get out of it in 3 years to give your investors their money back. you're not in a situation where, you can really trust that the market inertia is going to take that value up now. You're in a situation where it comes down to basics. Are they selling? Are they making money? Do they have sticky customers? The normal, I'd call it bread and butter of venture capital. So I think there is going to be a change. And I think as we get into next year, I think raising for artificial intelligence is going to be a lot harder. It's going to be based on revenue. It's going to be based on technology. It's going to be based on governance.
And Sultan, just to quickly follow there, obviously some of the legislation that we've seen has been in reaction to developments from countries like China and their high tech in this space as well. Could that be what tips perhaps some sort of consensus in Congress to when they see that perhaps this is something they need to be getting ahead of as other countries pull forward that don't have that same red tape to get through?
That's a great question. You look at China on one side, which is moving incredibly quickly with very little regulatory input. You look at Europe, which is moving very quickly on regulatory with kind of less AI, and the US is kind of in the middle. The question is going to be, the balancing act between, letting innovation move at the pace of innovation or, slowing it down through some sort of regulatory evolution. And, the US has always kind of lived in the middle of those two worlds. And right now we're seeing that represented politically with one party being very much in favor of one and the other being very much in favor of the other. You can figure out who that is. And out of that, we're going to be in a situation where over the next 12 to 18 months, I'm hopeful we'll get to consensus, but I'm not sure we are because the economic impetus is still on lack of regulation. And that's still what's driving the fundamental investments in AI. It's not government research like it was 30 years ago when I got started. It's fundamentally based on, do you make money? And so then there will be a push against a regulatory solution.
Ashley, this feels like conversations in so many industries. To what extent does regulation oversee the safety of innovation without stifling the actual innovation? How much of what's happening around the world matters to lawmakers? Does that speed things up? Is this kind of a wake-up call, if you will, that they've got to move quicker because they didn't necessarily do that with other issues like social media and crypto?
It absolutely is a wake-up call, and I think you really saw that momentum moving when the Biden administration rolled out their AI executive order shortly before the global AI summit in the UK, where Vice President Kamala Harris was there with Rishi Sunak and other world leaders, and they really wanted to get something out there before the summit to say, hey, here's what the US is doing, here's our approach, and we think it's the best approach when it comes to balancing innovation and also, reeling in the possible most dangerous behavior. And we want everyone to be reminded that the top AI companies are American, and we want them to continue to be supported and grow here and not feel stifled. However, we're still looking out for safety. So the White House has been very careful about sort of towing that line and making sure that message gets across on the global stage. They have indicated that they think the EU has moved too quickly and that they cannot let China be the leader on this either for obvious reasons. So that is the line they've been towing.
Okay, we'll be watching to see how things move from here. Ashley Gold, Axios technology reporter, and Sultan Meghji, former chief innovation officer, federal FDIC Duke professor, venture capitalist. Good to talk to both of you today. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you. Bye.